Social isolation and loneliness. Let's talk a little bit about those two concepts. First of all, we know that they can certainly coexist and they can feed off of one another. The more socially isolated a person becomes, it can trigger those feelings of being lonely. And the more lonely a person is, the more they may engage in self-isolation and removing themselves from others and turning more internal to themselves. And now, of course, under our social distancing and COVID-19 keeping us apart from one another, that feeling of disconnection, of loneliness and socially being isolated has certainly increased for most people. And most of the experiences around social isolation and loneliness are experiences that people have had at some point throughout their lives, but are experiencing it now under a magnifying glass, and it is becoming disproportionate for many people. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those two concepts, because again, although they can certainly feed off of one another, they are separate entities. So by definition, when we talk about social isolation, what we're really talking about is physical separation. We're talking about people being disconnected physically from other people. Now, again, I know that under the current social distancing and physical distancing parameters that we have right now, people who've never experienced that are actually experiencing it. But there are also high-risk, vulnerable people who have experienced this most of their lives, and it's only now becoming much more magnified around what's happening with COVID-19. So certainly our elderly, people who maybe don't have a strong family or friend network to support them, who may have physical difficulties in communicating through hearing loss or visual changes that makes them self-isolate because they're not able to really engage in social activities or social connection. We also know that people who are living more rural sometimes can feel a sense of social disconnection or social isolation because of their physical parameters and physical limitations to connecting with others. But loneliness, on the other hand, is a subjective experience. People can feel lonely even in a crowd of other people. Loneliness is about a feeling of being disconnected or having no solid, meaningful relationship, either with yourself or with others, feeling dissatisfied with those relationships. There are two different kinds of loneliness. So one of them is something we call reactive loneliness, and we all have probably experienced this at some point in our lives. It usually happens around transitional points in our life, shortly after a divorce or a move or a loss of somebody that we cared about, a change in a work environment, changes in relationships, changes within ourselves, can all be triggers to a feeling of what we call reactive loneliness. It's a time when we have to cope or grieve the changes and the stressors that are going on in our life. But on the other end of that, we find ways to reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with relationships, find meaning and purpose in the changes that have been presented to us in our life, and the loneliness can lift. And then there's chronic loneliness, which is an all-pervasive sense of disconnection and dissatisfaction in any relationships or most of the relationships in a person's life. So what are some of the risk factors for developing chronic loneliness? Well, we know that particularly when we go through these transitions in our life, a loss of a person that we loved, a divorce, a change in a job situation, a move, loss of a friendship, there's a level of grieving. It could be a small amount of grief or it could be a large amount of grief. But grief that we just put on the shelf and we ignore can oftentimes become complicated. Complicated by the development of major depression, complicated by poor coping strategies, use of substances to kind of numb yourself away from all of those experiences that you're having. All of those things can contribute to a chronic sense of feeling lonely and disconnected from other people. We know that it is important that we alleviate our sense of loneliness because we know we are social creatures. We need other people. We are wired for social connections, but they need to be meaningful connections, not just large quantities of disconnected relationships, but meaningful, purposeful connections with other people. So how do we manage or mitigate the effects of loneliness to keep us connected to ourselves and to others? Here are a couple strategies I want to share with you. First, we have to allow other people to help us. One of the things that happens with chronic loneliness is after a period of time, your perceptions and your trust in relationships can be eroded. Doubting the motivation of people who are reaching out to help you, or doubting whether or not you are deserving of those relationships, all of which can become part of that distorted thinking that follows chronic loneliness. So the first step out is to really begin to allow other people to help. It means that you have to step into a place of feeling vulnerable to allow yourself to be the recipient of help and support. Second piece is allowing yourself not only to be the recipient of help and gestures of support from others, but to extend and offer those to other people as well. The sense of loneliness comes again from that feeling that the relationships are not meaningful. Just being around a bunch of people doesn't make us feel connected. But finding a way to reach out and support and help other people is the bridge to that connection. So being able to allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to receive help and support, and willing enough and brave enough to step out of your comfort zone to help and support other people is part of the dual relationship that can lift parts of that chronic feeling of loneliness. The third piece is tied to the first two, but is a little distinct in what we know supports people out of loneliness, out of chronic loneliness, is to step into the role as a caregiver. Now, I know that for most of you, you are professional caregivers. That's the nature of what the work is that you do. But I'm talking about caregiving not as a job, but as an empathic connection to somebody else. When we offer care, when we are responsible for supporting somebody else's needs, we are immediately pulled out of our own suffering and distress and into the shoes of somebody else. That empathic connection, we know from science, changes our brain's ability to feel good, releases a lot of the feel-good hormones in the brain. The more empathic we are, the more we feel connected to other people through the mirror neurons of our brain and through the positive hormones that are released in the body and in the brain. So caregiving is a nurturing act that absolutely will assist you in pulling yourself out of a feeling of loneliness. And caregiving doesn't have to just be for other people. It can also be for animals. We know that there is volumes of research around pet therapy and why being responsible for another living creature, whether it's a human being or an animal, puts you in a place of thinking about somebody else before yourself. And immediately the scale is tipped away from a sense of loneliness and more to a purposeful and meaningful connections. Another important component is to acknowledge and label the loneliness for what it is. You know, as a society, we tend to stigmatize loneliness. We talk about words like stress, and it has the connotation of being like, right on, you're stressed, you must be a high achievement, important person, busy all the time. But you say the word lonely, you talk about feeling lonely, and the connotation of you must be a loser. You must not be able to engage in any kind of good social relationships because you don't have skills, and on and on and on. It's important that when we reach out and we talk about feeling lonely, that the more we have that conversation openly, it destigmatizes the word, and we realize that many people that we think are engaged and social and connected and couldn't possibly know what it feels like to be lonely are in fact experiencing loneliness themselves, because the numbers tell us that a third of the population at some point or another experiences chronic loneliness in their life. That's a lot of people walking around feeling lonely and not talking about it. And finally, in our busy, crazy, hectic world, and we will get back to that, we can sometimes almost disconnect from ourselves. We're back to back with projects and tasks, and we don't take a long enough period of time to have a collective sigh, to pause, to engage in some mindful activities about how we are feeling. And if we don't do that, we become disconnected within ourselves. And that is another seed for the development of loneliness. So particularly now, while we are under COVID-19 restrictions, and even when those restrictions are lifted, there's going to be a hesitance, I'm certain, of people getting physically very close to one another. We've lost the ability for touch. We've lost the ability for social connection through physical presence with one another. As we slowly return to a life where we are around other people, it's going to be very important that we pay close attention to our internal feeling of being lonely, about how that has been triggered with this pandemic, how we need to recover and restore ourselves back to a place of meaningful connections, and then making sure that we're eliminating the components of social isolation or physical isolation. How are we strategically and mindfully staying connected to one another? Because we know at the end of the day, we are social creatures. Our emotional and physical well-being is absolutely tied to social connection with others. We know that social isolation and loneliness absolutely has a negative impact on our physical and our emotional well-being. In fact, loneliness is connected to keeping our body in a chronic state of fight or flight or freeze, which means all of those stress hormones are chronically circulating. And the longer that they circulate, it depletes our immune system and our ability to stay healthy and well, which is why loneliness and social isolation are connected with increases in depression, heart disease, inflammatory processes in the brain that puts us at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. We know that people who are socially disconnected from other people tend to not take as good care of themselves. So not eating well, not sleeping well, engaging in high-risk activities like drinking and smoking and not exercising. We know that when people don't have meaningful relationships, their ability to fight off infections or rebound after a heart attack is depleted. And in the absence of meaningful relationships, our ability and our interest in living and thriving is depleted, and major depression can take over. And now more than ever, under COVID-19, we must maintain our physical and emotional well-being, physically keeping ourselves as strong and healthy as possible, and managing our emotional well-being to remain resilient to cope with the pandemic that we are currently under. So here's to staying socially connected and engaging in meaningful relationships, taking the time to not just be scrolling through social media, but engaging, truly engaging with one another in a way that can lift that feeling of being lonely. I'm Dr. Lori Stevick-Rust, and we'll see you in the next one.